For a broader perspective now on women in conflict and their role in peace building, I'm joined by Sanam Naraghi-Anderlini. She's the co-founder and executive director of the International Civil Society Action Network, or ICAN. Among her publications is the book Women Building Peace: What They Do, Why It Matters. Ms. Naraghi-Anderlini is in Washington. You've talked about women as being kind of an early warning system in conflict zones. What do you mean by that? What are you driving at?
What we see is that women on the ground very often are the first ones to feel and hear and see what's going on around them, and basically are the first ones to tell us that situations are escalating, or, for example, in the case of rising extremism, what kinds of messaging is coming through which targets women, and specifically with with the extremist ethno-national or religious movements around the world, regardless of where you're looking at it, when it's that exclusionary identity-based type movements, they all have a particular agenda when it comes to women. And so naturally, women become the first ones to say, look at what's rising, whether it's to do with reproductive health rights in places, or whether it's to do with, for example, in Tunisia, when the Salafis came in, they started talking about trying to lower the age of marriage to 9. Now, from the outside world, people might turn around and say that these are cultural issues. But women on the ground understand that it's not about culture. This is a particular ideology that's being sort of thrown into the mix. And as I say, it's when they start saying you should marry girls at the age of 9, or that girls at the age of 3 can be sexually attractive, and that's why they need to be wearing a hijab. These are signs. These are signs of what's coming up, which is going to be worse.
You've also talked about how, when it comes to women in extremism, that the extremist groups recognize the power of women. How so?
So here's the thing, that women in any society throughout time and geography, frankly, have always played an important role, both in the family context, but also societally and at the community level. Sometimes it's been invisible because they're not necessarily in the formal power structures. But in the family context, they're incredibly influential. Behind the scenes, they're incredibly influential. And I think that what we're finding more and more is that extremist movements recognize that power and influence, and that's why they've been tapping into them. And at the same time, the women's movements, those who have had the courage to become activists in the space for democracy or rights or peace and pluralism, when they speak out, they're being targeted. And they're being assassinated in Libya and Somalia, with all the women that we work with, that many of them have had death threats. And so the question becomes, if they weren't influential, or if they weren't a threat to the message of extremists, they wouldn't be the targets of assassinations and death threats. It must be that they're saying something and doing something and offering something that is authentic and alternative to the messages of the extremists, which threatens their ideology. So I think that's also how we see it, that they understand that power.
So if women were actually listened to, whether it's early on in the stages of conflict or as activists, how do you think they would change the agenda, for example?
I mean, we're seeing this right now, that if you take the case of Syria, for example, all the women that I have worked with who are coming through organizations that they've formed in the last, since the beginning of the war, some of them have been in women's movements before. Others are women who were engineers and doctors and architects, and basically have mobilized to provide relief and do peace building work at the community level. But in the 6 years I've worked with them, I've always, especially those coming from inside the country, they've always said one core common message, which is the world is helping us kill each other. They're not helping us talk to each other. We need to be at the table. Syrian civil society, or Syrian civilians, are not really represented in the peace process. And this has been reverberating, and it's true, because what you see is that the way the international community looks at the problem is, it's either pro-regime or pro-opposition, even though the opposition has had all sorts of problems and many of the leaders aren't necessarily inside the country. But civil society, and it's very much women-led, is actually on the ground, and they're pro-Syria. And their approach is very, very different in terms of what needs to happen and how to think for look at the vision for the country moving forward. As one colleague said, you know, they're willing to sit with the devil to make the war end, but they're also willing to recognize the humanity behind the weaponized young men. You know, whether they've been forced to fight for the army or in the militias, they're saying there's a humanity behind that, and we have to tap into that and rebuild the country together.
Are you seeing any change yet?
Change at the international level in terms of policies and inclusivity, you mean? You know, yes and no. I mean, I think when I started this work back in 1996, and then specifically looking at the question of women in 98 and talking about women as peace builders in 98, 99, there was literally a handful of us around the world who conveyed this message and recognized the importance and had the empirical evidence and the conceptual framing that, you know, said, look, here's why we're talking about these issues. Now, of course, you know, you have heads of state mentioning these things. We have national action plans. Canada has a national action plan on women, peace, and security. We have all the sort of policies and rhetoric that you want. But really, to make the change, it's going to take a proactive approach of understanding that we cannot, you know, the wars that we see, the conflicts that we see, are not just political, military matters that happen in a field far away where the front lines are removed from civilians. They're happening within society. So it's a societal war, and it has to be a societal peace process. And you can't just reward, if you want to, you know, we can't just say those with guns and those who have a capacity for violence get to come and talk about peace. We need them because they need to stop the fighting, but we also need the peace actors, and we need to recognize people who have been courageous enough to become active in the context of war without using violence, and recognize that courage and commitment. And that's a paradigm shift that I'd like to see happen.
Thank you very much for your time on this.
Thank you.